Okay, my topic this afternoon is Mises and Rothbard, the history of thought. Before I start, I want to point out some similarities between two very, very different men, at least in terms of their generations. They were two generations apart, and in terms of their cultural background and their personal temperaments. Mises was born in pre-war Vienna, and Rothbard was born right before World War pre-war, meaning pre-World War I Vienna. Actually before the turn of the 20th century. And Rothbard was born before World War II in New York City. So they couldn't have been more different. Rothbard was kind of a jolly, very approachable man, and Mises was an old world gentleman, very formal. He had a good sense of humor, very dry wit, from what I understand. I never met him. But Rothbard just loved telling and hearing jokes, and would stay up until the last student went to bed when we had these Mises universities that he was attending before 1995. So I consider them the two greatest economists of the 20th century. Let me just give you some of their similarities. They were both creative geniuses who presented a complete system of economic theory. They both worked in virtual isolation from mainstream academia for the most productive periods of their careers. And despite their extraordinary intellectual abilities, both Mises and Rothbard were extremely humble. I know that personally from Rothbard, I know that Rothbard was very humble. He had intellectual humility. He didn't have a false modesty. He realized what he accomplished, but he interacted with others as if they were peers or equals. What their ambition was, they also didn't try to be falsely original. They didn't think that they were developing economics from scratch. They both felt that they were developing the works of their masters. In Mises' case, the master was, actually there were two, Karl Menger, and then Menger's follower, who directly taught Mises, Eugen von boehm-bawerk. Okay, I'll put some names up in a moment. And in Rothbard's case, of course, the master was Mises. Okay, so they were building on what had gone before. Okay, they weren't trying to overturn everything. Both published comprehensive treatises on economics at crucial junctures in intellectual history. And these two treatises prevented the falling of Austrian economics into oblivion. Okay, so they were really timed well when they appeared. And finally, they were both very passionate, very intransigent, meaning they wouldn't yield in their devotion to seeking the truth, okay? Despite the fact that they were virtually alone in their positions at the time when they were doing their most productive work, okay? They both followed Karl Menger's original vision that all economic phenomena derives from individual human values and choices. So that's how they were similar. Now, what I want to talk about is how the Austrian school was developing and their place in the development of the Austrian school. Let me give you tell you two tales, one very briefly, the other one in more detail, of how the Austrian school, I'll get this right, yeah. Okay. How the Austrian school came about, how it declined, and how eventually it was reborn. Okay, so the conventional story... Did I spell Kersner wrong? The conventional story is you can find in the works of Israel Kersner. It's scattered throughout his works, beginning in the 1970s and going on through the 80s and 90s. And then it was more or less put together as a coherent account in Bruce Caldwell's book, Hayek's Challenge, his intellectual biography of Hayek. There's an alternative revisionist view that took seed in the early 1990s, Salerno-Hulsman account. Notice the sequence and the differing size of the names indicates the importance of the two authors. Okay, Hulsman wrote a great book. Mises, The Last Night of Liberalism. That account is in that book. He doesn't agree with me in every detail. And then I had written 2 articles, one in 1999, and then another one in 2002, both of which are in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. And it sets forth this account really in 2 parts. Okay, what is the conventional account? The account that all Austrians accepted, even myself, up until the late 90s when Lou Rockwell just asked me to write sort of a tribute to Murray Rothbard. And what I did was I sort of blew it up into the second article. The first article came as, this article is really an introduction to human action. So in thinking about the role of human action in the development of modern economic theory and then of Rothbard's contributions, I sort of pieced together this account. So the account given by, let me see if I have it right. The conventional account, basically, is the following. Austrians, they don't really talk about the beginning of the Austrian school. They sort of say, well, the Austrian school is riding high in the 1930s. Many people accepted Austrian business cycle theory as the most appropriate and indeed the only clear explanation of the Great Depression. They don't really focus too much on the micro stuff, but they claim that people are becoming Austrians. And then suddenly, it was the Keynesian avalanche, okay, the Keynesian revolution, okay, came out of nowhere, okay, and suddenly just buried Austrian economics, okay. As Murray once said, poured it down the Orwellian memory hole, okay. So people just forgot about it, okay. So that's how it died. It died in 1936. It was riding high, and then suddenly and inexplicably, it was just forgotten. So it was gone for a while. Then, just as suddenly and inexplicably, there was a big bang. In 1974, 2 events occurred which allegedly ignited the revival of Austrian economics. One was the Austrian Economics Conference held in South Royalton, Vermont, popularly known as the South Royalton Conference. It was the first conference held in North America, first Austrian conference ever held in North America. There were about 30 attendees. I was one of them. There were 3 sort of senior Austrian economists, Murray Rothbard, Israel Kirzner, Ludwig Lachmann giving talks, formal presentations, but Henry Hazlitt also showed up and gave a talk, and Percy Graves, who was a student of Mises, but never got his PhD, was also there. And it was really a remarkable event. I mean, before the South Royalton Conference, there was no Austrian movement to speak of. Okay, there were isolated people who were reading different things on Austrian economics, and mainly Rothbard, as I'll point out in my own story, and really unaware of each other's existence. Okay, I can remember when I first came upon Austrian economics in my junior year in college. When I went home that summer, I went to the local library and I took out all Austrian books I could find, okay? And the last date on them, like the last person to withdraw them did so, 1952, 1946. It was amazing. And so, I was alone. That summer I was working between my junior and senior year as, I guess it was a janitor at an AT&T facility, and I would get all my janitorial work done, and then by maybe by 1 or 2 o'clock, and then I'd go into this little cubbyhole, this little janitor's closet with this one yellow, naked light bulb hanging there, and I would read. It was the first major Austrian work I was reading, America's Great Depression. So I felt so alone. I was alone. I was in a closet by myself with the door closed. Okay. So I don't want to downplay the importance of that event. Okay, the Austrian Revival certainly coalesced at that point, but that wasn't the beginning of it, as I'll argue. And then the second event, which occurred again remarkably, and we were all stunned by it, was the awarding of the Nobel Prize to Hayek in October of 1974. So according to this account, these 2 events then brought about the Austrian Revival. Okay, and there are, I'm right now, giving you the sort of the broad brush view. There are more subtleties to it. But that's basically what I sort of believed until the 1990s, and I think what most Austrian economists believed. Okay. There's a couple problems. There's a number of problems with this explanation. First, the Keynesian avalanche Big Bang theory itself is sort of a problem, especially the Big Bang part of it, right? I mean, who told these people to throw a conference? It was funded and run by the Institute for Humane Studies. How did they know anyone would show up? I mean, did they hear this voice, like in the movie, Field of Dreams? Hold it and they will come. Hold the conference and they will come. No, I mean that's a problem. You have to have more of an explanation than that. Second, it attributes almost no role to Mises and Rothbard in the Austrian Revival. No significant role. Okay. Third, it treats the Austrian school as a monolithic movement whose members all agreed with one another from the very beginning. Okay, throughout through the 1970s and onward. Fourth, it doesn't really deal with the importance of the institutional framework, which is dependent on having property and resources, meaning institutes, books, libraries, internet sites, and so on. Okay, it treats individuals as if they're almost pure minds and they're somehow communing with one another, and what the product of these minds are does not depend on what resources are devoted to their research or to encouraging their research. Fourth, it portrays Murray Rothbard as somehow dropping out of economics somewhere in the mid-70s, becoming a social philosopher slash libertarian activist, okay? And just writing and devoting himself to these sorts of activities through the 1970s and 1980s. And finally, it ignores the tremendous influence of Joseph Schumpeter, okay, on a large part of the Austrian school, particularly the fourth generation, which was Hayek's generation. Okay. Schumpeter's often, he's cast aside as someone who is not an Austrian, and he's not in the Mengerian sense, though he was born in Austria, and who therefore did not have any influence on the Austrian school. Well, that second part's a non sequitur. He had a lot of influence on the Austrian school. Okay. Okay, so what I propose to do now is to give you the alternative story, the revisionist story. Let me just put something up here. Again, I don't put Guido's name on here because I'm not sure if he agrees with all the details of this. A lot of the raw material of what I'm saying is in his book, and in fact, he commented on an original draft of one of these papers and made me realize the importance of Schumpeter and Schumpeter's influence on the Austrian school. So what I'm going to do is just talk briefly about the rise of the Austrian school, which occurred between 1871 and 1914, and then a decline. The Austrian school, by 1914, that is World War I basically, it began to decline. And I'm going to explain the reasons for the decline. Okay, I'll go through all of these. There was the leader of the Austrian school after Menger stopped contributing to economic theory by about 1890 or so. Became boehm-bawerk, and by 1905, for various reasons I'll talk about, he was declining, and then he died prematurely in 1914. At the same time, Schumpeter's star was rising. There was also a huge, thriving Austrian-American school, or Austrian school in America, known as the American Psychological School. That pretty much disappeared after World War I. And there's Alfred Marshall's economics came to dominate not only in Great Britain, but in the United States. I'll explain that. And Hayek emigrated to England, and in a way, unwittingly, he contributed to the degeneration of Austrian economics in Great Britain. Okay? And finally, there was certain the Austrians themselves were somewhat to blame for the decline of the early Austrians, okay, before Mises, Menger and boehm-bawerk, and I'll explain there were certain problems in their system that led people to think, well, it's really a non-mathematical version of general equilibrium theory, and it's old-fashioned. We can state these truths more elegantly using mathematics. Okay. So let me just mention a little bit, or show you a picture here of the generations, just so you have in your mind what I'm talking about when I give you the account. Okay, for the first generation, the founder was Karl Menger. Everybody really sprung from him. But there were two traditions right at the beginning. Okay? And one tradition went through boehm-bawerk and included Mises, who was boehm-bawerk's student, and a lesser economist, who was also a very good economist, Richard von Striegel. And then Wieser taught Schumpeter and Hans Meyer, and they were also the third generation, okay? But they were in a different line, okay? And I'll talk about the difference between two lines. And then there was a fourth generation that was a little bit influenced by Mises. Everyone thought that Hayek was a student of Mises. He was never a student of Mises. He finished his graduate education without ever having taken a course of Mises, even though they were at the same university. He himself says he took one, he signed up for Mises' course, and after one class, he walked out and never came back because he thought Mises was arrogant and was kind of a right-winger, and so on. Okay, and then there were other economists that were didn't stay true to their Austrian roots like Hayek did, but were still Austrians, Haberler, Machlup, Morgenstern, and so on. And then just to mention the American Psychological School, well, let me just then, I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so basically, during the 1880s, the second generation, boehm-bawerk, Wieser, and there were others, all began to write papers and articles and books in the spirit of Menger. Okay, as Mises says, before the 1880s, there was no Austrian school. There was only Karl Menger. Okay. Boehm-bawerk wrote his great work on capital, both the critical work on previous capital interest theories, and then his own positive work during the 1880s. Wieser wrote a book coming up with the notion of opportunity cost, applying marginal utility theory in a kind of a way that sort of twisted up the true meaning of Menger. But those books got a lot of notoriety. By the 1890s, the Austrian school had an international reputation. By the time the century turned, by the early 1900s, the Austrian school was considered the cutting edge of theoretical research. So they were rising. Okay. Schools grew up in the U.S., led by John Bates Clark, who had anticipated some of the things that the Austrians had written, and was a big supporter of marginal utility theory, of subjective value. And then his followers formed consciously what was called the American Psychological School, which is misnamed. It was really a praxeological school. Okay. And they were the American Austrians. And then there were the British Austrians, Philip Wicksteed and William Smart. William Smart translated some of boehm-bawerk's works for an English audience and wrote a little book summarizing Austrian value theory, which came out in 1890, I believe. So already this stuff was in English. And Philip Wicksteed wrote a great treatise. He wrote a little book called The ABCs of Economics based on the Austrians sometime in the 1890s, I believe. But then wrote a big treatise in 1910. Okay. And then Edwin Cannon in the 1920s put Menger sort of in plain language for British economists and was the chairman of the London School of Economics, a very prestigious school in Great Britain, and eventually his student became chairman at 29 years old. Lionel Robbins, at 29 or 30 years old, became chairman, and he also could read German, and the LSE became sort of a hotbed of Austrian economics in Great Britain. So everything was looking up for the Austrians. Okay. Now, what happened that undermined the Austrian school and caused it to die out? I think it started to die in 1914. It didn't suddenly disappear in 1936, as a conventional account holds. Okay, a few things happened. First of all, unfortunately, boehm-bawerk, after he wrote his magnum opus, The Positive Theory of Capital, which raised so much interest throughout the world, and it came out in 1889, that year he went into government service. Bad idea. Used up all of his energy in government service. Was the Minister of Finance twice or possibly 3 times during the period from 1889 to 1905. He came back to academia in 1905, but he was basically in poor health. His energy had been sapped. Let me read you some accounts of what he was like. Basically, he was no longer the leader. Okay. Now, this was written by him, or someone else, an observer wrote this, and said, at the age of 54, when he returned to academia, he seemed older than his years suggested. Okay. Then he himself described himself 2 years later, when he was 56, as an old man. And then Mises writes, very interestingly, he attended boehm-bawerk's great seminar, which he started in 1905 and carried on till the time of his death in 1914. Mises observed that in this period, quote, boehm-bawerk could have produced much more if conditions had permitted itself, but its physical constitution could no longer stand the hard work necessary to embark upon great works. His nerves were failing him. The 2-hour seminar already taxed his strength. So working for the government will do this to you. So stay away. All right. So he no longer had the vigor, had the health to sort of take command of the Austrian school and give it direction. At the same time, while he was in academia, von Wieser, his brother-in-law, who really misinterpreted Menger, what von Wieser was interested in marginal utility was adding it up to find out what sort of system would give us maximum social utility. So even though he talked in terms of marginal utility, and he talked about subjective values and so on, he had a cardinal notion of utility. He also thought that you could use utility in mathematical economics. So he tried to combine sort of Menger's utility, though he changed it to a cardinal notion, with mathematical economics. And basically he wound up being a general equilibrium theorist, a verbal general equilibrium theorist. That is, analyzing an economy in which change was not important. So what happened was that he got when Menger retired in 1903, Menger stopped contributing to economic theory in the 1890s. And then he retired in 1903. And so Wieser was given his chair. So he became the big professor at the University of Vienna. When boehm-bawerk came back in 1905, he was given a made-up chair. They just made up a chair because he was a great statesman and so on. So he was just a guy hanging out. Or that's what, everyone felt that, well, he's not the real professor. It's Wieser. A couple years later, Schumpeter comes on the scene, a brilliant young man, who then falls on the influence of Wieser, who's his teacher. And Wieser sort of dabbled in mathematical economics. And Schumpeter followed that lead up and began reading Walras, who was the original mathematical economist, or at least general equilibrium economist, and became sort of a mathematical economist. Now, Schumpeter was extremely ambitious, extremely intelligent, charismatic, personable, and so on. And in 1908, so now he's basically still in his 20s, right? He writes a book on the method and the nature and essence of economic theory. It makes a big hit in Austria, but basically in that book, he supports general equilibrium theory. Okay, even though he himself is not a mathematician of any note. Okay. But then in 1911, he writes a book on business cycles and economic growth, which is still an important book to read, The Theory of Economic Development, which gives him worldwide fame. So even boehm-bawerk, okay, who criticized him severely, criticized Schumpeter's works, believed that he was the star of the Austrian school. So it wasn't just, and of course Wieser did, because Wieser was his teacher, even though Wieser himself was critical of Schumpeter. So then Schumpeter achieved an international reputation. Now where's Mises in all this? Mises is just someone in boehm-bawerk's seminar, along with Schumpeter, who is just pushing along and writing a great book, a book that turns out to be The Theory of Money and Credit, that comes out in 1912. But it doesn't make the splash, internationally certainly, that the Theory of Economic Development makes. He doesn't gain the reputation that that Schumpeter gained. Okay? So he is not seen as the leader of the Austrian school. So suddenly, the Austrian school is shunted onto the wrong track. Now it's Wieser and Schumpeter. Okay? Boehm-bawerk dies in 1914, prematurely. Mises was at the front. He was riding on a patrol. He was a cavalryman. He was connected with the artillery, but he was out on patrol, horse patrol. He was on the Russian front, and he was handed a telegram that said, boehm-bawerk passed away. Okay, so and there was sort of an undertone that he may have committed suicide. Okay, that boehm-bawerk may have committed suicide. Okay, that's never been substantiated. It's only a rumor. Don't let it get out of this room. Is David Gordon here? Okay. He's probably the source of that whole rumor. Anyway, okay, so boehm-bawerk is dead. And Wieser publishes a treatise, which was the first complete treatise on Austrian economics in 1914. It's called Social Economics. And it gets big play certainly after World War I ended. It was translated almost immediately in 1926, not immediately, but into English. So the Wieser line then becomes the Austrian school. So the price and value theory, which focuses on individual actions and non-measurability of marginal utility, that all falls out. Okay? So Mises now comes back from the war, gets an unpaid position at the University of Vienna. He's a Privatdozent, an unpaid lecturer there, teaches a course and also a seminar, and also has his own private seminar. And what he does is he invites people who get their PhDs under Wieser, of course. So Hayek comes into the school in 1918. And between 1918 and 1921, all these brilliant young men enter the University of Vienna. Okay, who do they have as their teacher? They have Wieser as their teacher. He's still the main professor to teach basic economic theory. Okay. Some of them take Mises' course, which is focused on monetary theory and socialism. And he changes their minds. They were basically all social democrats. He changes their minds when his great book on socialism comes out in 1922, and they discuss it in the seminar and so on. So they become more free market. They become free market. But they already formed as economists. They already have the vision of Wieser. And as Hayek tells us in his memoirs, the two books that they were very excited about for general economic theory, okay, Wieser's book was, okay, that was the main text, but he read from it. Okay, he either read from it or memorized it, some of these guys said. So that was kind of boring. But Schumpeter's books, 1911, 1908, he's a man of the world now. I don't know if he's left for Harvard yet, but Matt, do you know if he's left for Harvard by the... 1920. Okay, so he's around. He was the president of, he was a finance minister in 1919 or 1920. So, he's a big presence there, and they're really excited about his books. So they absorb Wieser's sort of clunky mathematical or clunky general equilibrium economics, and then the great rhetorical presentation by Schumpeter. And so they think a lot of Mises, but they think, well, he's just he's a great monetary theorist. And he's a great political economist and criticizing socialism, but he's really not a theorist of any depth. He's not a system builder like Schumpeter, like Wieser, or even like boehm-bawerk was. Okay. Now Mises starts to write articles between 1928 and 1933 on methodology, on correcting his masters Menger and boehm-bawerk on subjective value theory. So, and he publishes that book in 1933, he publishes a book, Epistemological Problems of Economics, as a book of essays. But by then, these guys already are doing their own work, okay? So that sort of prelude to human action, which is Mises' systematic treatise, is lost on them. Okay, they begin to see that he may be a system builder, Hayek says, but they've already moved past that. They're already doing their own work based on Wieser and to some extent on Schumpeter. Okay. What happens elsewhere? Okay, so the Menger, boehm-bawerk line is almost dead by the 1920s. Wieser's students get a lot of the professorships there. When he retires, Hans Meyer gets his chair. So they carry on the Wieser line. What happens in the United States? In the United States, Fetter and Davenport hate each other for some reason. They're always arguing with one another and viciously. And some of the articles in journals are interesting. So they're so busy fighting with one another, feuding, that they don't develop any real disciples. There's a couple of guys who wrote some interesting works in the 1930s, Vernon Mund and J.R. Turner, but there's no school, okay? There's no school of thought anymore. So basically, the American psychological school collapses after World War I, okay? And they were very influenced by Menger and boehm-bawerk. And then the British Austrians are still there, which we'll get to. But what happens is, in the meantime, Alfred Marshall has written his great in the sense of Great Depression, not great in the sense of great work. His great treatise, Principles of Economics, which takes, in 1890, takes Britain by storm, okay? By 1910, most of the economists that were in Britain that were under the influence of the Austrians now become Marshallians. Now, Alfred Marshall wanted to be realistic in his economics. So what did he do? He said, well, the Austrians went overboard, saying that everything depends on subjective values. He says, they're half right. Demand depends on subjective value. But the classical school is right about supply. It depends on cost of production. So prices are determined by supply and demand, which are two blades of a scissors, the cost blade and the utility blade. Okay? He also moves the focus of economics away from the consumer and consumer choice and so on, and he focuses on the businessman. And he focuses on one market at a time, not on the overall economy. He tries to explain how the businessman reacts and to changes in costs and changes in demand and how the firm allocates resources and so on. So his economics then takes over in Great Britain, okay, except for Wicksteed, who wrote a treatise, as I said, in 1910. And then in the United States, because now there's a vacuum in theory. In the United States, after psychological school collapsed, all you had was institutionalists, people who didn't believe in theory at all. So economists that were interested in theory immediately or begin to adopt during the 1920s Marshall's view. Okay, so the Austrian price theory, value theory is sort of gone in the 1920s. Okay, so now the Austrian school is collapsing in Austria itself. Okay, it's gone along what I would call a wrong track. There's a branch that's just that's leading to a dead end, and it's gone in the United States. Even in Italy and France, it was beginning to take hold. Marshall's school begins to take root. They try to combine the Austrians and Marshall, okay? And really, most of them, they just muddle things up. And mathematically, economics is starting to grow now in the 1920s in Italy and France. Okay, so that was one of the problems that I mentioned. The other. Okay, so let's go on to another problem. Okay, so Hayek then gives this brilliant series of lectures on the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which is he brings it to Great Britain in 1930. Gives these series of lectures. They became the book Prices and Production, which was published in 1931. On the basis of that work, he's invited to go to Great Britain and to join the faculty of the London School of Economics, which is already Austrian. It's the sole remaining outpost of Austrian economics in Great Britain. Everybody else is a Marshallian. Everyone else believes in Alfred Marshall. Keynes himself says, really, you don't have to read anything else. It's all in Marshall. Okay? So most of the economists in Britain believe that, really, you just read Marshall and then you do some applied work. You read the newspapers. That's what Keynes said. You read Marshall, and then you just read the Financial Times or the London Times every day or something like that. Keynes had one course in economics, by the way. Just one. It was under Alfred Marshall. Had one semester of economics. It shows, doesn't it? It was later work. Okay. So Hayek emigrates. Now, what does Hayek do? Again, Hayek is, of course, he himself is not a mathematical economist, and he has elements of general equilibrium theory, though, in his view. So what begins to happen is that Hayek tells some of the young graduate students and professors, John Hicks, for example, Nicholas Caldor, that they should begin reading some of the continental mathematical economists. Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian who followed Leon Walras. So they begin to read Pareto, and then they think, this is great. This is a more elegant statement of what the Austrians were talking about, or at least Wieser and Schumpeter and so on. So John R. Hicks, who's a brilliant young man and was an Austrian, wrote a kind of a quasi-Austrian book on wages in 1932, writes this book and called, it eventually comes out in 1939, it's called Value and Capital. And it's just general equilibrium theory in English, okay? And he has some equations in there. So what happens is that he becomes the leading star now at the London School of Economics. So Robbins, who was very much a follower of Mises and wrote great articles between 1928 and 1933, and 1935 actually, applying Austrian value theory and price theory to various problems and developing it further on his own, and writing a great book on methodology based on Mises' methodology called the Nature and Significance of Economic Science. He sold out to Keynes. He became a Keynesian later on, but he first sells out to the mathematical school. He himself's not a mathematical economist, but if you look at their records of his syllabi, okay, the syllabus, they change. So in the beginning on his syllabus, he has, let's see. Yeah, he lists on the works. He teaches a course in general theory at the LSE. So he has works by boehm-bawerk, Wicksteed, Feder, Clark, Davenport, all the great guys, okay, early on. He says that you have to know these works, and he uses some of them as text, some of them are prerequisites to get into the course. And then, about 1934-35, he begins to put mathematical texts and general equilibrium texts on his reading list. Gustav Cassel, who's a Swedish general equilibrium theorist, Pareto, who's the Italian general equilibrium theorist, Enrico Barone, who's a student of Pareto. Anyway, he writes in 1935, there's a note in his syllabus, it says, "The treatment will be non-mathematical in character. Students who wish to witness the same problems treated mathematically should attend course number 66. I'm pretty sure that's Hicks's course. Introduction to Mathematical Economics. So by now he sees no difference between the two approaches. Well, one's mathematical, saying the same thing. Okay? So he kind of backs off. Then he comes under the influence of Keynes, and by the late 1930s, early 1940s, during the war, he becomes sort of a Keynesian, and he repudiates his great work in 1934, they wrote in 1934, on the Great Depression, which was written from an Austrian point of view. So the Austrian school is dead. The Austrian school is dead before Keynes' general theory applies. So, it's dead by 1934, 1935. It's been dying, and it's completely gone. Now, Mises sees this. Okay, in 1934, he takes a job at the Graduate School of International Relations in Geneva. Okay, so he takes this job in Geneva, and he's there from 1934 until 1940. And from 1934 until 1940, he publishes very, very little. He publishes two journal articles and a bunch of reviews and popular writings. And yet he was very prolific up to this point. Okay? He had also written Liberalism in the 1920s, as well as the first two books I mentioned. And he wrote a book on interventionism. But now he doesn't write any more books. What is he doing? Well, he sees the Mengerian theory dying, and what he does is basically work on his great treatise, which is going to be Human Action. So, national economy the book comes out in its German form as National Economy in 1940. Unfortunately, the war has already broken out in Europe in 1939. It's written in German, so there is no market anymore. The Swiss publisher goes bankrupt, and so the book doesn't appear until 1949 in English. Okay, after mainstream economics has really developed. Okay, so a couple of problems that Mises fixes in that book, which I just want to quickly mention. One, the early Austrians really reasoned in terms of a barter economy. They didn't integrate money. And Mises started to do that in his book on money in 1912, but he really didn't complete the job. So he completes the job in Human Action so that he has a theory of monetary calculation that we talked about when I talked about socialism. Secondly, since they were talking in barter terms, general equilibrium theory is really stated in barter terms. Since money's not introduced and there's no special job for money to do, well, you can state their system in some sense in mathematical terms. So a myth grows up that Austrian economics is simply verbal general equilibrium theory. Let's just all learn mathematics, and it's much more elegant, it's easier to work with. So Mises shows that no, this is there's a mistake in the way people are applying general equilibrium theory. He shows that it's important, the concept of equilibrium is very important, but it has a very narrow role to play, okay, in distinguishing profits from interest, and that's it. So he clarifies in that book the important role of equilibrium. Okay, he shows how narrow it is. And then third, there is no entrepreneur. Okay, though Menger and boehm-bawerk mention the entrepreneur, and they give very interesting hints about the entrepreneur, and even Wieser talks about the entrepreneur as leader, and the one who moves the economy, there's no well-worked-out theory of the entrepreneur. Mises supplies that theory. The entrepreneur is the motive force. Now, the entrepreneur you cannot fit into general equilibrium theory. Okay, so that's where we are after World War II. What happens after that? There's not much happening. Mises gets a position that's financed by the Volcker Fund at NYU in 1946 or so. He begins a seminar, and there's only a few American economists and others that gather around him. He writes a good book in 1956, Theory of History. Henry Hazlitt writes a great refutation of Keynesian economics. Rothbard writes a one article on the reconstruction of welfare and utility economics. Kurzweil comes out with a very good book on methodology, the economic point of view, in 1960. But during that period, there really is no Austrian school. There's just these people meeting, most of whom are not really PhD economists, going to Mises' seminar, and then meeting afterwards for discussions and so on. Okay. So, when did the revival of Austrian economics occur? Well, I submit that the revival occurred, you can date it almost precisely, at the date that Man, Economy, and State was published in 1962. So, Mises' human action sort of saved the Mengerian tradition and fortified it and clarified it in 1949. Okay, so it was there. Okay, he put it together in a workable way. It took Rothbard writing Man, Economy, and State. Okay, and during that time, take into account all the literature, because it took him from the early 1950s to 1962, over 10 years, to write the book. And he takes account of all the new developments in post-war economics and refutes them or uses parts of them that he finds useful. So that's when I would say we had the revival of the Austrian school. And here's how it occurred. So he writes Man, Economy, and State in 1962. Shortly thereafter, the case for 100% gold standard comes out as an article in a book edited by Leland Yeager. Very important defense, probably the really first comprehensive defense in history, intellectual history of the 100% gold standard. Then the next year he writes America's Great Depression, 1963. So this is his creative genius is flowering now. In 1963, he also writes, he publishes his dissertation, which wasn't really a foundational work. I just put it in there to show you that's something else he did then. What has government done to our money? Which was supposed to be a chapter in Man, Economy, and State, and it was actually what he wrote as sort of the sample chapter to get the funding for writing Man, Economy, and State. He's not working in academia now. He's living on funds from the Volcker Fund, for example, and other foundations are giving him funds. So, but yet in that small pamphlet, there's really the first theory of how a commodity money degenerates into a fiat money. Okay, even Mises himself in Human Action says whether or not there was actually ever any episode of true fiat money in history is a matter for the historians to study. Because it all could be credit money. That is, government temporarily suspending the payment of gold and silver for notes and deposits, but people having faith that eventually the government would remove the suspension and then go back to a gold or silver standard. So Mises himself wasn't quite convinced, even though theoretically he believed fiat money was possible, he wasn't convinced that it actually had shown up in history. Rothbard shows how it does show up. Okay? So even though it's a small pamphlet, and also it's just a great introduction to monetary theory. And then he writes a small pamphlet, which happened in my development to be the first thing that I read, Depression, Cause and Cure. I read that when I think beginning of my junior year, after I had taken intermediate macro and principles of macro, and I read this in 45 minutes, and I said, geez, this is the realistic account of the inflations and depressions and so on, the business cycle. Okay, all the other stuff is just crap or nonsense. Okay, I didn't say crap then. So anyway, and then he writes Power and Market, or publishes Power and Market. That was completed in 1962 as part of Man, Economy, and State. It wasn't published. It was considered to be too radical. And then he writes a great work on political economy, For New Liberty, Libertarian Manifesto in 1973. So we can answer the question then, why did people come to South Royalton? Because we all had read Rothbard. That's what unified us. We had read all of these works. Mario Rizzo, Richard Ebling, myself, Jerry O'Driscoll, I go on, Roger Garrison, okay, so on and so on. So that's why once we heard that Rothbard was going to be there, that there was going to be an Austrian, and Kurzner had come out with a book in 1973, very influential book, but it was only in 73, Competition on Entrepreneurship. So we were interested in Austrian economics. So these graduate students and young faculty members, they knew that we were out there, okay? People were writing to Rothbard and so on. So Rothbard and Kurzner, convinced them that, a conference would be successful. Okay? So it was really the Rothbardian revival. Rothbard almost single-handedly was responsible for the revival. That's not, as I said, to downplay the importance of South Royalton, because South Royalton did bring people together. It did bring about the formation of an actual intellectual movement. Okay, and all right. So then let me just sum this. There's a few. I have 10 minutes left. What happened after that? Because it doesn't all end there. Okay, there were some great conferences after that, funded by IHS. In 1975, there was a conference in Hartford. I gave, myself and other junior economists, gave papers, and people like Rothbard and Kurzner, even Hayek happened to be there. Hayek commented on the first academic paper I ever gave. Okay, Kurzner commented on it, but Hayek got up and served as a second informal commentator. And I'll never forget that one part of my paper, I had cited him and wrote a little bit about his work on international monetary economics. And he says, I had forgotten that I made a contribution in this area. And he wrote a great little book in 1937 on it. So anyway, that was a great conference. Then the next year, there was a conference in England at Windsor Castle. And there they brought in some American Austrians. I didn't go, but Roger Garrison went, Murray Rothbard, Israel Kurzner. And they brought in some sort of Austrian economists, such as George Shackle and some others, Brian Loseby, from Great Britain. And there's a split already, okay, because the others were like Ludwig Lachmann, who also happened to be a speaker at the South Royalton Conference. They didn't really believe that prices conveyed any meaningful information. The actual prices you and I pay when we go to Walmart, they didn't think that they were meaningful. They thought that information changed so quickly, okay, that people had different knowledge all the time, that the world was like a kaleidoscope. So if you turn a kaleidoscope, you don't know what pattern will emerge from the pattern that you're currently looking at. When you turn it, it's something totally different. There's no connection between the two states. And Lachman believed, because knowledge changed so quickly and so radically, that from moment to moment, that entrepreneurs really couldn't predict the future or couldn't forecast the future. Okay. So what began to happen then was they began to finance programs at NYU, New York University, where Kurzner was, and then at George Mason University later on, a few years later. And they began to stress Hayek and Kurzner and downplay Rothbard and Mises. The rationale was that Hayek was much more palatable to the mainstream. he wasn't as extreme. He didn't express himself in language that would put people off. Okay, whereas Mises was too extreme. Mises, was unyielding. He would never yield a point, and so on. And the same thing with Rothbard. So what began to happen then was that the financing. Okay, now this is where property comes in. And the institutions began to emerge that supported that second Austrian branch that we talked about. Okay, the non-Misesian Austrian branch, the Hayekian Austrian branch. And those institutions, Rothbard was involved with the Cato Institute, which also grew up, and with IHS. But by 1982, for various reasons, they split. And after 1982, now I was involved in some of these conferences from 1982 to 1985. We were told to talk about the spontaneous order, not to downplay praxeology, and so on and so forth. And I was sort of naive then. I didn't know what was going on. I was figuring, it was presented to us as, well, we want to get other mainstream economists interested, and, you can teach whatever you want, but, just use these buzzwords and so on. But things were not quite, there was a definite push towards that branch. Also, funding was given to NYU to bring Ludwig Lachmann over, who was way more radical, radically anti, I would say, the first branch, the Misesian branch. Okay, so he was coming over to the graduate program in Austrian Economics, which they started at NYU. So things turned against Rothbard, and so the myth grew up that because Rothbard, no one was paying attention to Rothbard anymore in the early 1980s, that Rothbard dropped out and went into political action and social philosophy and so on. Well, that's all nonsense, because if you look at some of the works that Rothbard wrote in the early 1980s, he wrote The Mystery of Banking, he wrote Ethics of Liberty, he wrote the great article, The Myth of Neutral Taxation, 81, Law, Property Rights, and Air Pollution, another great seminal article in 1982. He wrote The Federal Reserve as a Cartelization Device, a long article on political economy of the Fed in 1984. The Case for the Genuine Gold Dollar in 1985, and the two books I mentioned, Ethics of Liberty and The Mystery of Banking. Okay, so things were looking pretty bleak. By the mid-1980s, I realized myself, I had gone to a Mises Institute conference, and then I sort of became blackballed. So I realized that there was really two different branches, and that they had all the resources, we had none. And then a man named Lou Rockwell started the Mises Institute in 1982. They had their first conference in 1983, which I did attend, and then they began to grow. And by 1987, the Review of Austrian Economics was started, and that's really sort of, I think, the point at which people began to move back to the Misesian branch of economics. And so let me just read you I have 5 minutes. A few words about this. Rockwell founded the Ludwig von Mises Institute in 1982. Austrian Economics which was Austrian Economics unabashedly inspired by the scientific vision of Mises. When Rockwell suggested the idea of an Austrian journal as an integral component of this institutional rescue effort, Rothbard immediately saw merit in the idea and began to use the journal as a way of reclaiming Austrian economics. Okay, so Rothbard wanted a distinct and bold name for the journal. Okay, so initially he was talking about calling it the Journal of Post-Misesian Economics, but Roger Garrison talked him out of that, so we got, fortunately, it's a review of Austrian economics. But then a lot of the young people that had come up through the other branch were pushing, for Larry White and so on, they were pushing for the Journal of Market Process. And when Rothbard opposed that title, there was a mass boycott of the journal. A lot of the board of editors just quit. Okay, so then it was an open split by then. So in 1982, Rothbard closed his remarks on this controversy over the journal's name with the following statement. He says, at any rate, we have a tough row to hoe in Austrianism in general to rescue it from Lachmann, shackle nihilism, Stanford probababble, meaning there were some people at Stanford that were trying to use probability theory in Austrian economics. Modern philosophy and fuzzy Hayekianism. All this makes a hardcore institute all the more necessary. And that's, in fact, what Lew Rockwell founded, was a hardcore institute. He gave us an infrastructure and the resources necessary to continue our work, to continue the Menger, boehm-bawerk, Mises, Rothbard line. So it's not just creative genius. Creative genius is important, okay? But there aren't any more Mises and Rothbards. Yet Austrian economics moves forward, okay? And it moves forward because it has the concrete institutional facilities and support that's necessary to fuel any sort of intellectual movement. Okay, and so it's really a lot of it's embodied here at the Mises Institute. Thank you.